June 17, 1982. A test field outside Moscow. Nikolai Bezdetnov eased the control stick forward and felt the machine come alive beneath him. The engines howled. Dust kicked up in a wide grey ring. And then, slowly, the strangest helicopter anyone in the Soviet Union had ever built lifted a few feet off the ground and simply hung there, steady in the morning air. To the engineers watching from the edge of the field, it looked wrong. Helicopters were supposed to have a long tail with a small spinning rotor on the end. This one had no tail rotor at all. Instead, two sets of rotor blades sat stacked one above the other, spinning in opposite directions. And there was something else missing. Behind the pilot, where every other gunship in the world carried a second crewman, there was nothing. Just armor and empty space. This was the V-80. In time, it would be called the Ka-50. The world would come to know it as the Black Shark. And the men who designed it were about to learn that their bold new machine carried a secret danger built into its very bones. A danger that would, years later, kill one of their finest pilots on this exact same date. But that morning, there was only the hover, the proof that it could fly, and the quiet pride of a small team that had decided to break almost every rule of helicopter design at once. To understand why they took such a gamble, you have to go back to the middle of the 1970s. Across the ocean, the United States Army had launched a program to build a new tank-killing helicopter. That program would eventually produce the AH-64 Apache. The Soviets watched closely, and they did not like what they saw. Their own main gunship, the Mi-24, was a big, fast, heavily armed machine. But it was also large and not very nimble. Soviet commanders feared it would not survive on a future battlefield crowded with missiles, so the order came down from the very top. The Soviet Union would build a new generation of attack helicopter. Its main job would be simple and brutal. Destroy enemy tanks near the front line, then survive long enough to do it again tomorrow. Two great design houses were told to compete. One was the Mill Bureau, the team behind the Mi-24. Their answer would become the Mi-28, a machine that looked much like an American Apache. The other was the Kamov Bureau, led by a chief designer named Sergei Mikhaev. Mikhaev had taken over the bureau after its founder, Nikolai Kamov, died. And Kamov had built its whole reputation on one unusual idea. Almost all of its helicopters used twin rotors, stacked one on top of the other, turning in opposite directions. This is called a coaxial design. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. The Navy loved these machines. On a crowded ship's deck, a helicopter with no long tail saved precious space. So Kamov spent decades perfecting the coaxial layout on naval helicopters like the Ka-27. When the Army contest came along, Mikhaev and his team did something daring. They took everything they had learned at sea and aimed it at the battlefield. Their design rested on two ideas that most experts thought were reckless, maybe even impossible. The first idea was the missing tail rotor. On a normal helicopter, the big main rotor on top wants to spin the whole aircraft in the opposite direction. The small tail rotor exists only to push back against that twist and keep the machine pointed straight. It is vital, but it is also a weakness. The tail rotor eats up engine power. It is fragile, and in combat, a single bullet through that thin tail boom can send a helicopter spinning out of the sky. Kamov's twin-stacked rotors cancelled each other out. One spun left, one spun right, and the twisting forces balanced perfectly. That meant no tail rotor was needed at all. And the benefits were enormous. All of the engine's power went straight into lift. The machine became shorter and more compact. It could turn flat in the air, swinging its nose to aim its gun without changing direction. pilots called it agile in a way that no normal gunship could match. The second idea was even bolder. The K-50 would carry only one man. Every other attack helicopter in the world used 2 crew. One pilot to fly and a second man to work the weapons, find the targets, and handle navigation. The job was simply too much for one person. Everyone knew that. Mikhail's team disagreed. They argued that by the 1980s, computers had become good enough to take over much of that workload. An automatic targeting system called Shkval would help the pilots spot and track targets. Automatic flight systems would ease the strain of flying. Kamov believed one well-trained pilot could do it all, with the machine itself acting as his unseen partner. The reward for this gamble was tempting. Dropping the second crewman saved weight. That saved weight could be spent on more armor, more fuel, and more weapons. It also meant that if the worst happened, only one life was at risk instead of 2. During testing through 1985 and 1986, the results stunned the doubters. The workload on a single Ka-50 pilot turned out to be no worse than that of a fast jet pilot flying alone. The automation worked. One man really could fly the machine and fight it at the same time. The Kamov design had passed its hardest test, but the helicopter held a secret, and it was hidden in the very feature that made it special. Those 2 beautiful stacked rotors, the ones that removed the need for a tail, could turn deadly under the wrong conditions. The blades of the upper rotor and the blades of the lower rotor passed close to each other, again and again, thousands of times a minute. In gentle flight, the gap between them was safe. But during violent maneuvers, the kind a combat pilot might throw the machine into to dodge a missile, the blades could flex and bend, and if they bent too far, the upper blades and the lower blades could strike one another in mid-air. When that happened, there was no recovery. The rotors would shatter. The helicopter would simply fall. The Kamov engineers discovered this during the flight test program. Their investigation showed the rotor blades had clashed during hard maneuvers. The fix sounded simple. They increased the spacing between the 2 rotor systems, pushing the blades further apart to give them more room. A third prototype flew before the end of 1985 with the changes built in. But the danger could never be fully erased. It was part of the deal. The same twin-rotor layout that gave the Ka-50 its power and its agility also gave it this one terrible flaw. Push the machine too hard, beyond its limits, and it could destroy itself. The men who built it understood this better than anyone. It was the shadow that lived inside their masterpiece. To make up for that risk, Kamov gave the Ka-50 a level of protection no gunship had ever carried. The cockpit was wrapped in armor strong enough to shrug off hits from a 23mm cannon, a weapon powerful enough to tear apart most other helicopters. The pilot sat inside what was almost an armored bathtub. Then came the feature that truly set the Black Shark apart from every other helicopter on Earth: an ejection seat. This sounds simple, but it is one of the hardest problems in all of aviation. You cannot just fire a pilot upward out of a helicopter. He would be cut to pieces by the spinning blades directly above his head. For that reason, almost no helicopter in history has ever had a working ejection seat. Pilots in trouble were expected to glide the machine down using the spinning rotors, a tricky skill, and simply hope to survive the crash. Kamov solved the problem in the most dramatic way imaginable. When the pilot pulled the handle, small explosive charges fired first. They blew the rotor blades clean off the machine, flinging them away into the air. Next, the canopy was jettisoned, and only then, with the path above finally clear, did a rocket-powered seat haul the pilot up and out to safety. It was a violent, beautiful piece of engineering. The Ka-50 became the first operational helicopter in the world that could throw its pilot to safety at almost any height or speed. For the men who flew it, that knowledge was worth more than any weapon. Some said it gave them the courage to fly closer to danger than they otherwise would, and the weapons were fearsome too. Along the right side of the fuselage sat a 30mm cannon, the same hard-hitting gun used on Soviet armored vehicles, fed by around 460 rounds. The pilot could even switch between different types of ammunition in mid-flight. On its stub wings, the Kol-50 carried up to a dozen laser-guided anti-tank missiles, plus rockets and bombs. 2 engines drove it, and if one was knocked out, it could keep flying on the other. By the early 1990s, the Izaj machine was ready to be shown to the world. And that is when it earned its names. In the West, NATO gave it the codename Hokum, a word that means nonsense or trickery. In 1992, the Soviets flew it to the famous Farnborough Air Show in England. There, the crowds noticed an image of a werewolf painted on its tail fin. The nickname stuck, and for a while it was known as the werewolf. But the name that lasted came from the movies. In 1993, a Soviet action film called Black Shark gave the helicopter its starring role. The 5th prototype was painted a menacing black for the camera. After that, the name belonged to the machine forever. The Black Shark. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. On August the 28th, 1995, the President of Russia officially cleared the Kar-50 to serve with the army. The strange tailless gunship was finally a real weapon of war. Now it needed a war. It would find one in the mountains of Chechnya. In December of the year 2000, a small and secret group of helicopters made the long journey south. 2 Kar-50 Black Sharks, 1 Kar-29 helicopter, whose job was to find targets and pass them on, and a transport helicopter flying along as escort. They came from the Army's training center at Torjok, far to the north. The men flying them were among the most skilled helicopter crews in all of Russia. This was the Combat Strike Group, and it arrived under a veil of secrecy. There was good reason for it. Chechen fighters had reportedly put a price on the Black Shark's head. $1 million, the story went, to anyone who could shoot one down. The Russians took no chances. They parked the helicopters behind an earthen wall and the hull of an old wreck hidden from enemy shells. At night, they ringed the parking area with vehicles for extra protection. The group commander, Vasily Kanikov, later recalled that none of these precautions felt like too much. On January 6, 2001, a Black Shark fired its weapons at a real enemy for the very first time. The pilot dropped to an extremely low altitude, struck a target that the K-29 had marked for him, and pulled away. As he flew home, he felt an odd vibration through the airframe. He landed safely at the airfield, and when the engineers inspected the machine, they found the truth. A piece of shrapnel had nicked the tip of one rotor blade. The damaged section was carefully trimmed away by hand, and the helicopter was flown back to safety. The crew then waited weeks for new blades to arrive from the north before that aircraft could fight again. It was a small incident, but it showed how the Black Shark and its crews learned and adapted under fire. 3 days later, on January 9th, a K-50 went out with an old Mi-24 flying alongside it. Near the entrance to a mountain gorge, the pilot found a well-hidden ammunition store belonging to the fighters. He rolled into a dive and destroyed it with a salvo of unguided rockets. In early February, 2 Black Sharks and their target spotter found a fortified camp in rough, wooded country and wiped it out in a single pass. The mountains were where the Black Shark proved its worth. Up among the high peaks and narrow valleys, the thin air robbed normal helicopters of their power. The older Mi-24 struggled to operate above a certain height, but the Kar-50, with all its engine power feeding straight into those twin rotors and none wasted on a tail rotor, could work at altitudes above 5,000 meters. That was beyond the reach of the helicopters it flew beside. The coaxial gamble had paid off exactly where it mattered most. Over the weeks of testing, the strike group and its escorts flew well over 100 missions between them, with the Black Sharks and the spotter carrying out a large share. Russian officers praised the machine's reliability and the deadly accuracy of its electronics. By the standards of a tiny two-aircraft trial deep in hostile mountains, it was a clear success. But the story of the Black Shark is not only a story of triumph, it is also a story of the shadow that always lived inside it. Return now to that date. June 17th. 16 years to the day after Nikolai Bezdetnov first lifted the V-80 into its gentle first hover, the calendar came around again to June 17th, 1998. And on that day, the danger the engineers had fought so hard to tame finally claimed a life. The pilot at the controls was Major General Boris Vorobyov. He was the commander of the Army's helicopter training center at Torjok, the very place where the Black Shark had been refined into a weapon. He was one of the most experienced helicopter pilots in the entire country. Few men on Earth knew this machine better than he did. He was flying a demanding routine, the kind meant to show off the helicopter's full abilities. According to the official investigation, the aircraft entered a flight regime that had never been fully explored during complex maneuvering that pushed past the machine's set limits. As the helicopter pitched into a steep descent, the controls and instruments behaved in a way that could confuse even an expert. In that instant, the upper and lower rotor blades came together. The same flaw the designers had wrestled with in the 1980s had never truly gone away. And this time, there was no second chance. The general did not use the ejection seat, the one helicopter in the world that could have thrown him clear, and there was no time to reach for it. It was a bitter loss. Vorobyov was not just a pilot. He was one of the men who had helped turn this strange idea into a working machine. He had spent years coaxing the Black Shark toward greatness, and in the end, the very feature that made it brilliant, those twin-stacked rotors, was what took him. That tragedy hangs over the whole program. It is a reminder that bold engineering carries a price, and that the people who pay it are often the brave and the skilled. So why, after all this, did the Black Shark never fill the skies? The answer has less to do with the machine and more to do with history. The Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991. The new Russia that followed was broke. There was simply no money to build hundreds of expensive, cutting-edge helicopters. Production crawled along at the factory in the Far East, and at one point, the military refused to pay for the machines that had already been built, nearly bankrupting the plant. In the end, only about 18 Ka-50s were ever made, a handful of the most advanced helicopters of their age, and almost no army to fly them. There was a deeper doubt too. The grand promise of the single pilot, the idea that automation could replace a second crewman, never fully delivered. The clever electronics worked, but getting them to work perfectly, mission after mission, proved harder than anyone hoped. The debugging dragged on for years. The military had honest complaints. In a future war, asking one exhausted man to fly low through mountains, dodge missiles, find tanks, and fire weapons all at once might be asking too much. And so Sergei Mikheyev, the chief designer who had championed the lone pilot, made a clear-eyed decision. He knew there was no money to start over with a blank sheet of paper. Instead, he would take the brilliant Black Shark and give it back the thing it had so boldly thrown away: a second seat. The result first flew in 1997. It was called the Ka-52, the Alligator. It kept the famous coaxial rotors, the heavy armor, and the ejection seats. But now it carried two crew, sitting side by side, sharing the heavy workload the way gunships always had. The lone wolf dream had quietly given way to old wisdom. It was the Alligator, not the Black Shark, that went on to be built in large numbers. The two-seat machine became one of Russia's main attack helicopters, produced in the hundreds and sent into the fighting in Ukraine, where many have been lost. The single-seat Black Shark, the radical original, faded into the background. A bold experiment that pointed the way forward, then stepped aside for its own more practical child. And yet, it would be wrong to call the Ka-50 a failure. Think about what it actually achieved. It proved that a serious battlefield gunship could fly without a tail rotor, using the coaxial layout once thought fit only for the sea. It gave that machine power and agility that conventional helicopters could only envy. It became the first helicopter in history to offer its pilot a true ejection seat, solving a problem the rest of the world had given up on. And it tested, in real combat, the daring idea that one man and a clever machine might do the work of two. Every one of those lessons flowed straight into the Alligator and into the helicopters that followed. The Black Shark was a stepping stone, but it was a magnificent one. The kind of machine that comes along when engineers are brave enough to ask what if and stubborn enough to chase the answer even when it frightens them. Because that is the heart of this story. The men at Kamov built something that was, in a real sense, ahead of its time. They reached for a future of automated, tailless, single-seat gunships before the technology and the money were fully ready to catch up. They knew their creation carried a hidden flaw they could never completely cure. They flew it anyway. They sent it to war, and some of them gave their lives to it. The strange machine that hovered over a Moscow test field on a June morning in 1982 was a gamble from nose to tail. No tail rotor, no navigator. Just one pilot, two stacked rotors, and a wall of armor wrapped around a very big idea. It did not conquer the skies, but it changed what people believed a helicopter could be. And in the quiet courage of the engineers who designed it and the pilots who trusted their lives to it, the Black Shark earned its place in history. Not as the gunship that won a war, but as the one that dared to imagine a different way to fly.